Hello and welcome to Tales for Life. In each episode of this podcast, we'll explore a folk or fairy tale from a different culture or region and discover the life lessons, values, and morals they offer that we can use today. Join me on the journey through the magical and meaningful world of folk and fairy tales. Thank you for joining me for the 35th episode of the Tales for Life podcast. I've enjoyed getting to this point, and I'm happy that you're here with me. Today's story takes us back to a time when fairies existed and granted gifts, and so is appropriately titled, "The Best Gift is One You Use Well." The first consideration for all of us here is that we don't all have the same gifts. Some people are taller, some are more athletic, some have a real fondness for math, while others can draw. The list goes on and on. Just because you don't have one gift doesn't mean you don't have another. You definitely do. Gifts come in many forms. Some are tangible, others are not. But the true value of a gift lies in how we use it. A gift, no matter how wonderful it may be, is only as good as the use we make of it. Some gifts can be abused, making them terrible gifts, while others may be overused or not used properly, making them mediocre gifts. The best gifts are those we use in the right amount and make the most of. When we do that, those gifts enrich our lives along with the lives of those around us. This is a topic worthy of constant attention in our lives, so as you would expect, the folk in times past made learning these lessons about gifts enjoyable by placing them in a wonderful French fairy tale. The English language version of this tale dates back over 130 years, with the French version going back to the 1700s, making this tale older than the United States. It's titled Fairy Gifts. It generally happens that people's surroundings reflect more or less accurately their minds and dispositions. So perhaps that is why the flower fairy lived in a lovely palace with the most delightful garden you can imagine, full of flowers and trees and fountains and fish ponds and everything nice. For the fairy herself was so kind and charming that everybody loved her, and all the young princesses and princesses who formed her court were as happy as the day was long, simply because they were near her. They came to her when they were quite tiny, and never left her until they were grown up and had to go away into the great world. And when that time came, she gave to each whatever gift he asked of her. But it is chiefly of the Princess Sylvia that you are going to hear now. The fairy loved her with all her heart, for she was at once original and gentle, and she had nearly reached the age at which the gifts were generally bestowed. However, the fairy had a great wish to know how the other princesses who had grown up and left her were prospering, and before the time came for Sylvia to go herself, she resolved to send her to some of them. So one day her chariot, drawn by butterflies, was made ready, and the fairy said, "Sylvia, I am going to send you to the court of Iris. She will receive you with pleasure for my sake as well as for your own. In 2 months you may come back to me again, and I shall expect you to tell me what you think of her." Sylvia was very unwilling to go away, but as the fairy wished it, she said nothing. Only when the 2 months were over, she stepped joyfully into the butterfly chariot and could not get back quickly enough to the flower fairy, who, for her part, was equally delighted to see her again. "Now, child," said she, "tell me what impression you have received." "You sent me, madam," answered Sylvia, "to the court of Iris, on whom you had bestowed the gift of beauty. She never tells anyone, however, that it was your gift, though she often speaks of your kindness in general. It seemed to me that her loveliness, which fairly dazzled me at first, had absolutely deprived her of the use of any of her other gifts or graces. In allowing herself to be seen, she appeared to think that she was doing all that could possibly be required of her. But, unfortunately, while I was still with her, she became seriously ill. And though she presently recovered, her beauty is entirely gone, so that she hates the very sight of herself and is in despair. She entreated me to tell you what had happened and to beg you, in pity, to give her beauty back to her. And indeed, she does need it terribly, for all the things in her that were tolerable and even agreeable when she was so pretty seem quite different now she is ugly. And it is so long since she thought of using her mind or her natural cleverness that I really don't think she has any left now. She is quite aware of all this herself, so you may imagine how unhappy she is and how earnestly she begs for your aid." "You have told me what I wanted to know," cried the fairy, "but alas, I cannot help her. My gifts can be given but once." Some time passed in all the usual delights of the Flower Fairy's palace, and then she sent for Sylvia again, and told her she was to stay for a little while with the Princess Daphne, and accordingly the butterflies whisked her off and set her down in quite a strange kingdom. But she had only been there a very little time before a wandering butterfly brought a message from her to the fairy, begging that she might be sent for as soon as possible, and before very long she was allowed to return. "Ah, madam," cried she, "what a place you sent me to that time!" "Why, what was the matter?" asked the fairy. "Daphne was one of the princesses who asked for the gift of eloquence, if I remember rightly." "And very ill the gift of eloquence becomes a woman," replied Sylvia with an air of conviction. "It is true that she speaks well, and her expressions are well chosen, but then she never leaves off talking, and though at first one may be amused, one ends by being wearied to death. Above all things she loves any assembly for settling the affairs of her kingdom, for on those occasions she can talk and talk without fear of interruption. But even then, the moment it is over she is ready to begin again about anything or nothing, as the case may be. Oh, how glad I was to come away, I cannot tell you." The fairy smiled at Sylvia's unfeigned disgust at her late experience, but after allowing her a little time to recover, she sent her to the court of the Princess Cynthia, where she left her for 3 months. At the end of that time, Sylvia came back to her with all the joy and contentment that one feels at being once more beside a dear friend. The fairy, as usual, was anxious to hear what she thought of Cynthia, who had always been amiable and to whom she had given the gift of pleasing. "I thought at first," said Sylvia, "that she must be the happiest princess in the world. She had 1,000 lovers who vied with one another in their efforts to please and gratify her. Indeed, I had nearly decided that I would ask a similar gift." "Have you altered your mind then?" interrupted the fairy. "Yes, indeed, madam," replied Sylvia, "and I will tell you why. The longer I stayed, the more I saw that Cynthia was not really happy. In her desire to please everyone, she ceased to be sincere and degenerated into a mere coquette, and even her lovers felt that the charms and fascinations which were exercised upon all who approached her without distinction were valueless, so that in the end they ceased to care for them and went away disdainfully." "I am pleased with you, child," said the fairy. "Enjoy yourself here for a while, and presently you shall go to Philida." Sylvia was glad to have leisure to think, for she could not make up her mind at all what she should ask for herself, and the time was drawing very near. However, before very long the fairy sent her to Philida and waited for her report with unabated interest. "I reached her court safely," said Sylvia, "and she received me with much kindness, and immediately began to exercise upon me that brilliant wit which you had bestowed upon her. I confess that I was fascinated by it, and for a week thought that nothing could be more desirable. The time passed like magic, so great was the charm of her society. But I ended by ceasing to covet that gift more than any of the others I have seen, for, like the gift of pleasing, it cannot really give satisfaction. By degrees I wearied of what had so delighted me at first, especially as I perceived more and more plainly that it is impossible to be constantly smart and amusing without being frequently ill-natured and too apt to turn all things, even the most serious, into mere occasions for a brilliant jest. The fairy in her heart agreed with Sylvia's conclusions, and felt pleased with herself for having brought her up so well. But now the time was come for Sylvia to receive her gift, and all her companions were assembled. The fairy stood in the midst and in the usual manner asked what she would take with her into the great world. Sylvia paused for a moment and then answered, "A quiet spirit," and the fairy granted her request. This lovely gift makes life a constant happiness to its possessor and to all who are brought into contact with her. She has all the beauty of gentleness and contentment in her sweet face, and if at times it seems less lovely through some chance grief or disquietude, the hardest thing that one ever hears said is, "Sylvia's dear face is pale today. It grieves one to see her so." And when, on the contrary, she is gay and joyful, the sunshine of her presence rejoices all who have the happiness of being near her. Age-old stereotypes aside, this story is a great illustration of how any gift, no matter how good it is, can be misused. And we're not talking literal gifts here. The gifts, in the story specifically, but in our life generally, are just about anything. Character traits, talents, intelligence, good looks, these are the actual gifts. And we all have them, or at least one or two of them. And here's the point of the story. Any gift we have, when used to the point of excess, turns sour. Whether it's flaunting our appearance, droning on endlessly about our topic of choice, or whatever, a gift, or trait, or talent that you use without moderation and some common sense might still be a gift to you, but it's a curse to others. On the other hand, this story is also a great example of how even a small gift, or trait, or talent, or skill, when used appropriately, can be something wonderful to the person who has it and to those around that person as well. You can think of this gift as the gift of modesty. And I'm not talking about Puritan modesty here, but the sort of modesty that doesn't put yourself forward at every opportunity to try to get attention or praise. The modesty that allows you to quietly go about doing what you do, as well as you can do it, and letting others toot your horn for you. And there is the argument that if you don't toot your own horn, who will? But the answer to that is, everyone knows. That person at school who always gets good grades, you know. That person at work that always gets the job done, you know. The community helper, the person at church, whoever, none of them have to toot their own horn. And, typically, those who do don't usually have a legitimate reason for doing so. As we wrap up this episode, let's remember that our gifts, whether big or small, are meant to be shared with humility and grace. It's not about seeking recognition or praise or flashing our gifts in the faces of others, but about using what we have with modesty. When we do, we not only enrich our own lives, but also inspire and uplift others. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep nurturing your gifts and sharing them wisely.